Hello, everyone. Kia ora koutou. Good evening to those around the Atlantic Ocean, and good morning or afternoon to those of you around the Pacific. I'm Aaron Glass, an anthropologist on the faculty here at Bard Graduate Center, and on behalf of our dean and director, I'd like to welcome you to this second lecture in our annual series, Indigenous Arts in Transition. Though all of us on Zoom are widely distributed in both time and in space, those of us hosting this event are located on the island of Manahata in the heart of Lenapehoking, the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape, and a past, present, and future home to many Indigenous people. In fact, the largest number of Indigenous people resident in a North American city. Most of the Lenape were forcibly relocated westward between the 17th and 19th centuries, and some are reestablishing their presence and visibility in the city through the Lenape Center and in current exhibitions like Lenapehoking at the Brooklyn Public Library and Native New York at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I encourage you to check those out. Speaking of exhibits and museums, I am thrilled to introduce our speaker, Conal Mccarthy, who is Director of Museum and Heritage Studies Program at Victoria University of Wellington in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and an honorary professor at the Humanities Research Center at the Australian National University. With degrees in English literature, Maori language, art history, and museum studies, he has established himself as one of the foremost chroniclers of the history of museums and exhibitions in New Zealand, with particular attention to complicated Indigenous settler, or in the local vernacular, Maori Pakeha dynamics. McCarthy has played a key role on many international research teams exploring the cultural and political interfaces between museums, archives, art worlds, academia, and Indigenous peoples under colonialism. And he's currently one of the co-editors of the journal Museum Worlds, Advances in Research. His former positions have included lecturer in art and art history at the University of Waikato, exhibition and public program developer at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa, educational officer at the National Art Gallery in Wellington, and surely the most culturally and politically challenging of them all, I'm sure, the chair of the board at the New Zealand Cricket Museum. Alongside dozens of journal articles, volume chapters, and reference works, many co-authored with equally eminent global museum scholars, McCarthy's 11 books include Exhibiting Maori, A History of Colonial Cultures of Display from 2007, Museums and Maori, Heritage Professionals, Indigenous Collections, Current Practice from 2011, Te Papa, Reinventing New Zealand's National Museum from 2018, Curatopia, Museums and the Future of Curatorship with Philip Schork from 2019, and forthcoming next year, The Past in the Present, How Maori Reinvented Museums and Anthropology in New Zealand, 1890 to 1940, which might just make its way into the talk somehow. Finally, a word on how this event will run. Conal will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open things up for discussion. We have a few colleagues joining us as panelists. We'll start with their questions, and for those not on the panel, please use the Q&A function. We have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC option at the bottom of your screen. We are recording this event, and a copy of the video will be available on Bard Graduate Center website and our YouTube channel afterwards. And with that, I am pleased to turn the Zoom controls over to Conal. Welcome, Conal.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Tēnā koutou whakarongo mai nei tēnei wā, kānui ngā mihi kia koutou, e tautoko nei tēnei kaupapa, nō reira kia ora hui mai tātou. I am going to turn my camera off so that I can read my text, and then when we have the panel discussion at the end, I'll come back onto the camera. In this photograph, we see two Māori men bent over a latticework panel, or tukutuku, carefully weaving dried strands of sedge grass or pingao through the board, slowly constructing a zigzag pattern known as pautonga. A second photograph taken a moment later shows the men standing and facing the camera and viewer, leaning on the tukutuku panel, drawing attention to their handiwork, allowing it to be documented on film. But these men are not anonymous craftspeople captured in some archival record of a colonised other, the kind of exercise in salvage ethnography unfortunately repeated throughout the British Empire. On the right, we see Peter Buck, also known as Tarangi Hirua, a medical doctor who was to become a well-known anthropologist of the Pacific, director of the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, and visiting lecturer at Yale. On the left is his friend Apira Ngata, lawyer and member of parliament. Together, through their involvement in the Dominion Museum, the Polynesian Society, and related government and community research projects, these Māori leaders effectively reinvented museum anthropology in Aotearoa, an Indigenous intervention possibly unique in colonial history, as well as launching a community arts and crafts movement, not to mention intervening in the Pākehā or European art world. What did this example of Māori arts mean to these men, and how did it figure in their plans for the present and future of their people, including engaging with the current discourses of art in the Pākehā world and internationally? What Māori concepts were materialised in the tukutuku, and how are they related to debates at that time and today about changing Māori art? What, might we ask, does the tukutuku say and do? These photographs were taken on the Dominion Museum ethnological expedition to the East Coast in April 1923, which was hosted and facilitated by Ngata himself. The collection and display of these vestiges of the past captured by this team in the form of objects, field notes, photographs, films and sound recordings, now preserved in archives, libraries and museums, all serve to construct what ethnologist Elsden Best called the Māori as he was. But this vision of the past was also the product of a Māori-led program of cultural and social development aimed at the present and future. Their strategic approach was summed up in a well-known saying of Ngata's: hold in one hand the material things of the European, ngā rākau a te Pākehā, and in the other the treasures of your ancestors, ngā taonga o ngā tipuna Māori. As Ngata put it in a paper to an audience of historians in 1928, this was about the Māori as he is and will be. This association should avoid the common error of studying the Māori merely as a museum object, he scolded them, and dismissing him from the story of New Zealand as it is today and as it will be tomorrow. These aspirations are evident in the tukutuku panel Ngata and Buck were making, with its geometric pattern, potama, denoting a stairway to heaven, or knowledge, or prosperity, depending on the interpretation. Here's an image of a completed panel, which sits between the carved posts, or popo, of a whare whakaero, or carved meeting house, a contemporary example in the meeting house of my university, now named after the meeting house, Te Heringawaka. The pattern may be likened to the aspirations of Māori leaders in early 20th century Aotearoa, who sought material progress for their people, a step up within the settler state. There was more to this object than decorative effect, however. The practice of making latticework panels in meeting houses reflects a fundamental ontological framework which underpinned Māori social life, Whakapapa, roughly translated as genealogy or relatedness. In the literature on Māori art history, theory and practice, much ink has been spilt analysing customary native and tribal arts and tracing the transition to modern and contemporary art with a capital A, mainly from a Western aesthetic perspective. Not as much attention has been paid to Indigenous concepts and frameworks for their own visual cultural heritage. In this seminar today, I aim to first review a book on Maori artistry by an English artist published the same year these photographs were taken, and explore how it was linked to Ngata's strategy of public engagement through the Maori arts and crafts movement. Then I look briefly at Maori theories of their changing art forms, including taonga, treasure, in particular the idea of art as contemporary taonga, applied by Anna Marie White to a recent exhibition, Taimoana, Taitangata, by well-known Māori sculptor Brett Graham at the Govert Brewster Art Gallery in New Plymouth. Lastly, I return to the interwar years and examine more closely the notion of art as whakapapa as seen in the work of Apira Ngata. Unfortunately, Anna Marie was not able to present with me today, so I will focus my discussion on the last episode and a reading of tukutuku in the context of the decorated meeting house or whare whakaero. I want to acknowledge here that my analysis of this topic is related to several strands of research and publications just mentioned by Aaron, a long-standing interest in the colonial cultures of display from my PhD thesis published in 2007, an Australian project on museums, anthropology and governmentality published in 2017, the Gordon H. Brown Lecture at Victoria in 2018, and a recent book by Anne Sarman and multiple authors on the Dominion Museum Ethnological Expeditions 1919 to 1923. In all cases, my interest lies in how Māori actors have steered mainstream institutions and practices towards their own tribal ends, namely the ongoing survival and revitalisation of their culture. As the title of our recent book says, in the words of a Ngāti Porou leader from the 1920s, Hei Taonga mō ngā uru whakatipu, as treasures for the rising generations. Maori Artistry, written by English artist and picture William Page Rowe, appeared in 1928 with a foreword written by Ngata. This slim red book, designed with an elegant kōwhaiwhai border, was published by the Board of Māori Ethnological Research, along with two other monographs on Māori topics: Johannes Anderson's study of whai, or Māori string figures, and Felix Keesing's innovative analysis of changing Māori society. Māori Artistry is a relatively unknown work, which does not feature in the extensive literature on Māori art, despite its importance in fostering an aesthetic appreciation of Māori carving and other practices by Pākehā audiences. Of course, since the late 19th century, European artists and savants, such as Augustus Hamilton, later director of the Dominion Museum, had acknowledged the artistic qualities of Māori objects. But this volume is an unusually explicit recognition of Māori art at the time. It is with Māori art as art, Page Rowe wrote, with the artistry of Māori handiwork that I am concerned. Analysing a tauihu, or canoe prow, for example, he concludes that it is, quote, something very much more than an interesting ethnological specimen. It is a work of art. Previously seen as curio, specimen, and artefact, the objects previously thought of as primitive were by the early 20th century praised as art workmanship, art handicraft, and sometimes simply art. And by the 1920s and 30s, Māori practices such as carving and weaving, thanks in part to the development of the English arts and crafts movement, were usually referred to in the public domain as Māori arts and crafts. Page Rowe's book does not include weaving and fibre arts, and concentrates on carving as analogous to Western sculpture, but he did look at a relatively wide range of material: weapons and jewellery, body adornment, writing in relation to tattoo, tāmoko, that, quote, we must not let our natural prejudice against its barbarity prevent our appreciation of its undoubted artistic qualities. The author also looks at reed panels, tukutuku, taking a modern post-European example, he says, in opposition to the taste of the ethnologist and collector who may prefer pure traditional forms. Page Rowe demonstrates that the designer can leave the beaten track and still remain true to the spirit of his art, the new expression of an old theme, and nothing has been lost in the process. Ngata's foreword to Page Rowe's book, which he and Buck appear to have promoted and shepherded through publication, heralded the first serious study by an artist of Māori art, written with an uppercase A. Formerly, he noted, interest in Māori art objects was ethnological or commercial, but now, with the establishment of the government of the new school of Māori arts and crafts, the aim was, quote, the renaissance of the national art of the Māori. Page Rowe considers two contemporary themes. First, the recent emergence of naturalism in carving, seen here in the famous tāmoko panel by Ngāti Te Rāwhai carver Tini Waitiri. And second, the advocacy for the contemporary Māori arts and crafts movement. Here we see the license for Māori artists to explore and experiment with Western forms and materials, which even the relatively conservative Ngata believed, despite what later scholars claimed, would eventually develop its own hybrid style after a period of necessary preservation. Here, Page Rowe praises the revival of Māori art, writing about the 1926 Act of Parliament that set up the new school in Rotorua, quote, that its present expression must be in terms of its present environment, providing new means of expression for the Māori artist of today and tomorrow. William Page Rowe's image of a dynamic native culture was paralleled by anthropologist Felix Keesing's The Change in Māori, which is a very early study of cultural adaptation in the form of Māori farming on the East Coast. He writes, nor is the reassertion of Māori mana, authority, power, in any way retrogressive in being retrospective. It is the analysis of the present, in the analysis of the present, it shows how much of the ancient culture still survives. The ideal of these thinkers is to reinterpret this evolving culture and any culture forms that they may revive so as to express a new vision. So this theme of cultural adaptation was developed by Ngata and Buck from the work of New Zealand anthropologist Raymond Firth, who had studied with Malinowski. What they called the New Zealand experiment encompassed land development, farming, housing and schooling, fieldwork, along with visual and performing arts, including the building and decoration of meeting houses. As many as 30 new wharirunanga were constructed around Aotearoa in the 20 years during which the School of Maori Arts and Crafts was active. The underlying objective was, as Ngata put it, to use the carved house as a community focus to revive elements of Māori culture. As Ngata explained to Buck in a letter, the opening of the Raukawa meeting house at Otaki in 1936, seen here, was a matter of social value for Ngāti Raukawa. Ko riwhi rātou I te taonga he awhitanga mā o rātou ngākau, he whakahoki mai te wairo o rātou tipuna, he putahi mō ngā whakaaro o ngā taitamariki I roto I te ao Pākehā. This is a good example of one of the key Indigenous concepts employed at this time to articulate understandings of their culture and frame their intercession in museums, heritage and the arts. That is, taonga or ancestral treasure. This concept was theorised later by Hirini Moko-Mead, well known for his involvement in the famous exhibition Māori, which opened at the Metropolitan Museum in New York in 1984 as a, quote, highly prized object that has been handed down from the ancestors, or taonga tukuiho. Taonga may come from the past, but are situated in a present becoming future, a continuum of space-time which keeps the past alive in the present. But Mead warns that taonga, quote, is not the equivalent of an art object, even though it embraces it. Increasingly from the 1980s, this word taonga came to be applied generally in English to Māori objects in museum collections, including art. I now want to discuss how a theory of art as taonga has been developed and applied in a contemporary art curatorial project. Anna Marie White, a curator and art historian of Te Aotearoa descent who works at Toi Māori in Wellington, is one of the most important emerging scholars of contemporary Māori art. In her recent PhD thesis at Victoria University, she argued that, quote, many contemporary Māori artists who observe taonga principles in their work are stifled within the New Zealand art system. In the 1990s, these subjects were fiercely debated, resulting in contemporary Māori art being defined differently to the ancestral tradition of taonga. She addresses this rupture by reviving earlier arguments for contemporary Māori art to be defined according to the principles of taonga. That is, rather than an artist self-defining their work, that work is recognised by authoritative viewers and instrumentalised by them in the community. She then applies the concept of contemporary taonga to the artworks of Brett Graham, a Tainui artist, you can see here on the right, to argue that taonga production is active in contemporary Māori life and offers a new method to reconcile Māori art histories. Though Graham's work was not often recognised as taonga in art galleries, it was seen by Māori audiences as such. For example, the extraordinary video installation Aniwa Niwa, created with Rachel Rakena in 2006, which was shown at the Venice and Sydney Biennales, but was also presented by the Ngāti Koroki Kahukura Iwi as part of hearings before the Waitangi Tribunal. Because Graham was recognised as a kaumātua, an elder, because ritual ceremonies were used at exhibition openings, so the work was seen as an instantiation of tribal mana, like older artefacts more commonly seen as taonga, which appear in such ceremonial prestations. White concludes that Contemporary Taonga has the potential to radically reconceive and reorganise contemporary Māori art practice and history according to the practice of ancestral Māori traditions and determined by the authority and agency of Māori people. White lost no time in putting this theory into practice, curating a major exhibition of Graham's work in 2020-2021, along with a catalogue. She showed that Graham's work can be presented like Taonga, which convey the power of ancestral knowledge, instantiate tribal social relations, and operationalise tikanga Māori cultural practices and protocols. All this in contrast to the ways in which his work has been displayed and interpreted in the mainstream art world. The exhibition is called Taimwana Tai Tangata, a cautionary tale about human endeavour in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Taimwana Tai Tangata referring to a pepeha from the 19th century, talking about the ebbing flows and tides of the sea and peoples. White writes that the exhibition is a, quote, site-specific installation that electrifies the local landscape by telling a story of solidarity between those who suffered the harshest penalties of colonisation. The Tainui tribes of the Waikato region, where Graham comes from, in alliance with the people of Taranaki, where White comes from, who both saw invasion, destruction and confiscation in the New Zealand wars of the 1860s. She writes, 5 monumental sculptures memorialise experiences shared by Tainui and Taranaki, and in the tradition of 19th century Māori leaders, prophesy the future. Dark visions that implicate viewers in a trajectory of human development that threatens the well-being of all. The exhibition engaged with these iwi in the opening ceremony, and in the catalogue, White describes how this, quote, invoked the presence of their ancestors, transforming the exhibition into a whare kōrero, a house of talk. This metaphysical experience demonstrated a moment when contemporary Māori art becomes active as Taonga Māori, sweeping all in attendance on a tide of history, memory and ceremony. I don't have time here, unfortunately, to describe the powerful individual work in this very dramatic exhibition, which received great reviews at both the Government Brewster Art Gallery and later at the City Gallery, Wellington. But you can look at a video tour of the show on the Government Brewster Art Gallery website. White prefers Taonga to what she calls the Whakapapa definition, which seems to refer to the way that Pākehā art professionals, critics and writers identify and categorise Māori artists as Māori by their descent or ethnic identity. However, this could be construed as a slightly narrow usage of the word whakapapa compared to the wider sense, denoting not just ancestry, but an expanded relational system that encompasses human and non-human culture and nature. Tāwiri Taonui, for example, writes that whakapapa is a taxonomic framework that links all animate and inanimate, known and unknown phenomena in the terrestrial and spiritual worlds. The notion of Taonga is also contested and debated. Paul Tapsell refers to the art of Taonga, but sometimes this term is used to describe Māori art today, and sometimes it isn't. Some artists are uncomfortable having their work called Taonga and simply see it as art in the Western sense. Ralph Hōtere said that he was an artist who happened to be Māori and avoided any biographical interpretation of his work. In response, Bob Yankee said that he was a Māori who happened to be an artist. I don't want to get into the complex contemporary debates about Indigenous art and identity at this stage. What I would say is that Taonga can also be observed historically as a modern Indigenous response to museum collecting and exhibiting. Its meaning shifting from goods or property in general to old treasured heirlooms over the course of the 20th century. In the Māori language, the phrase whare taonga, or house of Taonga, these days tends to refer to a museum, whereas in 19th century Māori language newspapers, it generally referred to a shop. Claiming historical anthropological antecedents is tricky. Despite the fact that many modern and contemporary Māori artists like Brett Graham have achieved success in the national and global art world, as Roger Nietzsche pointed out 20 years ago, originally there was no Māori word or concept for art as such. Many contemporary artists see a break between the arts of the past and their own work in a Western medium and market, And indeed, Roger Nietzsche's study of Maori carving was called carved histories. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the next section. Suffice to say that a number of Maori artists have advanced, and Maori scholars have advanced theories of Maori art, including Hedini Moko Mead's chronological periodization for Maori art based on the image of a tree, seeds, growing, flowering, turning, kākano, te tipunga, te pua waitanga, and so on. Bob Yankees argues against the idea of tradition and argues for continuity between the past and the present through the notion of transcultural art. And then a bunch of art historians, Ngāti Ellis, Deirdre Brown, and the late Jonathan Mane, who are developing a Māori art history. And also Pākehā curator and writer Damien Skinner. All of these refer to concepts such as Whakapapa, but generally do so within. What I find interesting about native and tribal approaches to their art is that they sometimes parallel relational theories of visual culture, which move beyond the notion of representation. For example, anthropologist Alfred Gell's idea of art as a technology of enchantment, which mediates social relations such as a person might. This is perhaps analogous to the Māori idea that ancestral treasures are powerful living things which move through space and time and reconnect the present to the past. Following Gell, Nicholas Thomas argues that art is no longer just about text and symbolic meaning, but is also about doing, theorised as social relations. Gell applied this idea to Māori meeting houses explicitly, drawing on the work of Roger Nietzsche, the widely respected ethnologist at the Auckland Museum. In Nietzsche's investigation of tribal genealogies captured in an East Coast meeting house, the interior of the whare is a model of the tribal cosmos, including the timeless ancestral past and modern historical time. Gell argued, following Strathern, that a carved ancestor house is a form of distributed personhood, in which the ancestor is spread out in space and time. For Māori, Gell argues, agency is collective, ancestral, and political. In Māori society, carved ancestor posts are retrospective, looking back to the ancestral past, but as political gestures, they are prospective. They look out and forward to future relationships and networks. Likewise, in my work, I have examined museum and gallery exhibitions, Māori carving, photographs of Māori, and portraits of Māori by Pākehā painters as post-representational, non-aesthetic agents of ancestral power and efficacy related to the Māori notion of mana, roughly power, authority, reputation. I now want to explore the main customary concept which ngata used with reference to pre-modern Māori art. How does tukutuku function within the carved meeting house as whakapapa? In doing so, we should remember that tukutuku was an integral part of ngata's research on Māori arts and crafts and their revival, seen here in his own house, built in 1914, and here in the local Anglican church, St Mary's at Kitiki in 1926, and in the work of the arts and crafts movement in the 1920s and 30s. And here we see women from Ngāti Raukawa constructing the tukutuku panels for the meeting house Te Hauki Tūranga at the Dominion Museum in the 1930s. In the wide-ranging social development programs led by ngata and his associates in the interwar years, Whakapapa was the key intellectual framework underpinning the documentation, preservation and revival of cultural heritage, including art forms like tukutuku. Whakapapa is interpreted today as a complex, multidimensional relational system for ordering things, people and places within the same frame. Ngata wrote several texts based on his long-standing research into tribal whakapapa, which gives us a good idea of his thinking on the visual arts. He applied this genealogical method to the fieldwork he oversaw at the Board of Māori Ethnological Research, which was called in Māori Te Puari Whakapapa, or the Whakapapa board. Ngata posited Māori knowledge itself in the form of ancestral genealogies as the basis of content and the framework for ethnological research, including the arts. In letters, he explained how this could form their own conceptual framework or set of categories, literally baskets of knowledge. Ngata saw whakapapa materialised in weaving, rafter patterns, carving, netting, everything from huge and elaborate food stages for hakari or feasts to small woven kete or baskets, and significantly, lattice work for meeting houses, tukutuku like the one we see Ngata and Buck working on at the beginning of this lecture. Having discovered Ngata's manuscript, The Terminology of Whakapapa, in the archives of the Bishop Museum during our research project, Ngāti Porou artist and scholar Natalie Robinson has employed Ngata's term takiaho to analyse the historic films shot by James MacDonald on the East Coast expedition in 1923, but also her contemporary artistic practice as a photographer. Here are the key terms in Ngata's document. Ngata wrote that aho kaha was, and I quote, literally a line, string, or cord. In relation to a pedigree or genealogy, this is a figure that would naturally occur to a weaving, cord-making, net-making, fishing people. The reciter conceived a connected string on which the persons concerned in the matter of his recitation were strung along in sequence, and by lifting the string, displayed them prominently. As a practical method, Robertson writes, Whakapapa offers a way to make connections in the knots along the takiaho cord. She goes on to consider another word from Ngata's Whakapapa terminology. This is kowhata, to display as on a stage, or frame in tied bundles, as of fish or articles of food, the elevation giving prominence, showing off, if you like. The tribal artists and craftspeople captured in film, photographs and notes by the exhibition team, writes Robertson, are demonstrating ancestral practices. In this sense, lifting each sequence to display their skill. I want now to examine Ngata's remarkable thesis more closely, as edited and published with an introduction by his descendant Wayne Ngata in the Journal of the Polynesian Society in 2019. The first thing that strikes the reader in Ngata's manuscript is the cluster of words that evoke the practice of whakapapa expressed in material form, namely layering, orderly arrangement, and the tying together of ancient things, including ancestors or legends. Among the many meanings of the word whakapapa as a verb, writes Ngata, we may select as most relevant to our subject to place in layers or lay upon one another, whakapapa. The reciter of legends and traditions, of tribal history and genealogies, he continues, thus visualizes his act in turn as tracing incidents or personnel strung along strings or cords, or suspended on the beams, the cross beams of hakari stages, or from the first weft of a garment, or from the ridgepole of a house, or from any rod used to stiffen an object, or as uncovering the layers of stored information or a thatching. Unpacking the term tātai, which means to arrange or set in order, Ngata comments that it has the sense of adornment, as in the Māori equivalent of the classical expression of adorning or embellishing a tale. The terminology is therefore not simply a visual language, but suggests embodiment and movement, the intangible heritage of song and poetry which are performed, not just tangible crafts which are made. In Ngata's terminology, the act of tracing the particular string or cord in genealogy, fishing or weaving through the words taki or hapai also apply to, quote, the idea of leading or lifting either a song or chant or story, and the reciter would become the fugleman in a massed haka or peripuru. In another section of the terminology of whakapapa, Ngata draws parallels between the recitation of tribal genealogies and the physical form of a whare whakairo, a carved meeting house. Quote, in the term tahu or tahuhu, we have two conceptions. According as tahuhu is used as the first weft in the weaving of a garment, or as the ridgepole of a house, or as a stiffening rod, as in a tukutuku panel. In the expression tahuhu haere, the reciter is literally tracing this first weft, picking out the eldest son of the eldest branch of a family. The second conception of a ridgepole and of the tribe or sub-tribe or family as a house with its connected parts is the one which is more usually present in the mind of the expert genealogist. This passage reinforces some interpretations of the carved meeting house as a corporeal manifestation of tribal identity, but in a much more direct and literal sense, and using Māori concepts. The expert weaver and carver, like the Whakapapa expert, conceives the iconography of the house in terms of ancestral descent lines, selecting and emphasising particular ancestors and their progeny down to the present. The mauri, or the vital essence of the ancestors, flows through the body of the whare tupuna, the ancestor house, from the kōruru, the head, and tāhuhu, the spine or backbone, down through the heke and popo, the ribs, to the ancestors sitting on what is literally the ancestor's poho or belly below. Like weaving a cloak, or making a fishing net, or erecting a kōwhata, a food stage, building and decorating a house involves assembling particular tribal descent lines to connect the past to present needs and future visions. This sense of a creative and flexible cultural practice of establishing and sustaining social relations comes across clearly in Ngata's following passage. It has the idea, he says, of a horizontal arrangement with connected, suspended lines that fits with both the conception of a weft and of a ridgepole. The expert reciter was he who could most vividly impress on his hearers the array of related ancestors so that he might at will follow down any strand or rafter or popo or tukutuku with the connected details. Here Ngata shows that included elements in the house are integral to the transmission of the whakapapa through the carvings and woven lattice work panels around the walls. The descendants sit, talk, and sleep. Ngata gives the example of Tororangi at Waimatatini, named after the founding ancestor of Ngāti Tau, the famous house which was built in the 1880s, which he restored in the 1930s in the distinctive style of the Waipu Valley, including these extraordinary tukutuku panels. The interior of the wharenui then, with its combination of colour, texture and form, instantiates the links from the living to the dead, tracing right back to the ancestors of the iwi, papu or whānau gathered together in the house. This materialisation of whakapapa is not just a top-down system, however. As Ngata emphasises that it allows descendants to whakapapa, as a verb, back up to the ridgepole, the main line of descent. He writes, the internal decorations, whether carved popo or tukutuku panels, may in turn follow down from the tahuhu enumerated in the name of the house, or back up to the main ancestor of the tribe. So tukutuku and other decorative elements are therefore integral parts of the design of whare whakairo and appear to function explicitly to teach stories, songs, and so on, as well as convey genealogical connections. Natalie Robertson, drawing on Māori Marsden, argues that the word tukutuku literally refers to the weaving practice of threads being passed on through over, one thread crossing and connecting with the other. This notion of transference, she adds, applies also between generations. In another fragment of Ngata's research, we gain insights into how people moved and interacted within the house, including with the tukutuku around the walls. In old age, Ngata reflected on the study of Māori poetry and language, recounting his pleasure at the way that local children in the Waipu Valley were learning their culture through the same songs which he learnt in his youth. He then describes how this worked through the arts of the meeting house, and I quote, "Let us visualise the old Maori whare, with panels of lattice work on lathes of horizontal pieces. The child would begin the rhyme at the bottom of the panel and count upwards while reciting it. That helped children to memorise, to emphasise, to breathe deeply and expel the air economically so that it might be held to as high a point as possible up the panel." This vivid story of a child learning waiata by tracing the pattern of tukutuku on the walls of the whare gives us a glimpse of how it operated as an aid de memoire. It was clearly part of an embodied practice of learning language, culture, and history as a physical method or pedagogical performance that connected people to the ancestors, to the community, and to the environment around them. We can see here how the house and its decorated interior, the bosom of the tribal ancestor, situated the viewer, and how the rectilinear composition of the tukutuku panels, with its central vertical rod and horizontal lattice work, provides a framework against which the particular pattern plays out, like variations on a line of tribal descent, a visualization of the structure of Whakapapa. But more importantly, in Ngata's passage above, we sense what the tukutuku does, how it acts, enmeshing the respondent in its net of relationship, in its whakapapa. Here perhaps is a glimpse of an Indigenous system of knowledge in which the arts played a social role in teaching and maintaining the fundamental elements of tribal social relations. And I'm going to stop there and briefly show you references which you may like to follow up if you'd like to know more. You can get these off Aaron later on. And now I'm going to hand back over to Aaron and the panel. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Conal. That was incredibly rich and detailed, both in terms of the attention to the aesthetics of the objects and the conceptual foundations for them. And I will invite my co-panelists to turn on your cameras. And please use the raise hand function or your own raise hand function to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, and I will call on you to unmute and ask your questions. Other audience members joining us, please submit questions using the Q&A function, and I will monitor those and relay questions to Conal. While my colleagues are ruminating, maybe I'll take the liberty of asking the first question. One of the things that strikes me both as so rich in your talk, but also in the material you're sharing with us, is the very complicated conceptual interplay between the system of knowledge that you sort of ended with and the understanding of the art objects. And it raises the question for me, both in the 1920s and in the contemporary moment, for whom the art can work to activate these systems of knowledge. And that is, who has the conceptual and cultural vocabulary in order to recognize them as such. And I use the term vocabulary specifically because obviously I think everyone would be struck by how much your own reliance on Maori terminology to convey the system of knowledge was foregrounded. And I wondered, so my first question is, thinking back to the 1920s moment and the contemporary exhibition, can you give us a little more context about the conditions of literacy in Maori language, in which both Buck and Ngata at the time and White in the present as a curator could rely on legibility linguistic legibility in doing the work of framing or reframing the artworks in particular ways in those different moments of time? How much does a kind of common basis, linguistic basis, allow for the successful formulation of the concepts, both in the immediate sort of context of the art world, but also in the larger sort of social and political contexts in which the art was and is clearly being mobilized to do certain kinds of political work?
Great question, thank you, Aaron. In the 19th century, I think because literacy arrived very early with missionaries and writing and reading spread very quickly, some historians argue that the Maori population was more literate than the Pākehā population. So there was, a lot of, there was a profusion of Maori newspapers and publications and so on and so forth. However, having said that, Ngata and Buck and those leaders of the early 20th century were very much having a dollar both ways. Most of Ngata and Buck's correspondence is in English because they were conscious that that correspondence would probably one day be published in English. And the fragment that I read to you is from an incomplete section of Ngata's PhD, which he never completed, but he sent a section to Buck at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, and that's where it was discovered later. So he tended to do his public speeches and publications in English, although he had an ongoing dialogue with Māori scholars in the Māori language and moved very easily between the two. However, over the course of the 20th century, with the loss of Māori language due to the education system and various kinds of things, that's quite a different sort of situation in the post-war period. I can't speak for Anna Marie, but I know that in her thesis, she talks about that activation of Taonga principles in contemporary art happening through authoritative viewers. That is, she talks about the aniwa work and a Tainui audience at a particular setting of their hearing before the Waitangi Tribunal, trying to claim things, and so on and so forth. And she talks about the pōwhiri, the opening of the exhibition at the Government Brewster, and the instrumentalization of the Taonga principles by authoritative viewers, which does suggest people that are familiar with tikanga or familiar with those kind of concepts and so on and so forth. So there is a kind of a tension there, I think in the late 20th century with the modern and contemporary work, where again you can observe critics, curators, and artists having a dollar both ways, striding across both the kind of mainstream art world and the way it does things, but also in a way speaking to a Māori audience at the same time. And Anna Marie is a really, her work is a really interesting example of that. Using that concept of whakapapa and taonga, but doing so generally in English in a PhD thesis in art history. And and now she works for Toi Māori, where she works mostly with sort of Māori audiences. She's organising Matariki, the big festival of performing arts. But she seems to sort of be able to move very easily in both worlds.
I'm particularly interested. Oh, I see Maya has. I'm particularly interested in this sort of dynamic between the kind of impulse to educate, to raise consciousness as a means of expanding people's awareness of Indigenous concepts and categories of value, and at the same time foreclosing on the transmission of particular knowledges. So, and I think that's, that speaks to this, on the one hand, there's a messaging that there is knowledge being conveyed, ancestral genealogical knowledge, but not everyone can know it. And there's a kind of tension, and I'm sort of interested in
it's a really interesting element that comes into Hirini Moko-Mead's work in the 1980s, where he talks about particular word, he uses the word taonga and other words as a way of reclaiming an alienated material culture that's in museums. So it's a kind of a tool of reappropriation. We've got a PhD student, Awhina Tamarapa, an experienced curator, formerly at Te Papa, who talks about the transmission of knowledge about weaving as a pedagogy. So there's certainly a pedagogical element or education element to this.
Thanks. Maya.
Yeah,
Kia ora, Maya.
Kia ora. Nice to see you. Yeah.
And you.
Yeah, so wonderful to see all those images and hear you speak to them. But yeah, it was just kind of coming off what you and Aaron were just talking about, which is really fascinating just to hear and think about Anna Marie, kind of how you've just said it, actually, reclaiming Taonga, but in this, because I was thinking about a lot about institutional frames when you were doing your talk, because we're, you know, clearly the work Aniwa with Brett Graham and Rachel Rakana in the Biennale, and then you were showing the recent exhibition, you know, are in contemporary, you know, modern contemporary kind of that art frame. So just as Hirari Mokomid kind of recovered this notion of Taonga in the 80s, we were thinking very much in that kind of ethnographic framework. You know, is she doing that because there was this, you know, because it had been stripped away perhaps by a contemporary or the modernist Maori art movement, has to do something else in the 60s to kind of make Maori modernists stand up in a contemporary art world and an international one, but making it a very Maori kind of vernacular for modernism. And then in a way, she feels like we have to do that in the modern and contemporary world, because from the perspective of museums, in a way, it's perhaps easier for us to extend the notion of Taonga when you're looking after a historical collection, as I do, and then integrate contemporary pieces into that conversation. It's more cyclical, you know, it's a natural evolution, whereas perhaps in the modern and contemporary frame and the art gallery frame, she's having to recover that because it did get diverted. And so, as you said, for Maori viewers and Maori eyes, there was never a distinction, but perhaps, and they will read what they will into those works because they can leverage, as you've explained so beautifully, all those, the agency and all the Whakapapa and all those other things. But to Pākehā or non-Māori eyes, then it's this kind of wanting to acknowledge that these two are Taonga, whereas people maybe just thinking that they weren't. There's this disjunction that's happened. So maybe you could speak to that a bit. That
you know, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. That part of what Anna is doing is addressing this, what she calls a rupture in the 1980s and 90s, and that debate about, you know, what is Māori art and where does it sit and how do you define it and all of that kind of stuff, which was quite contested. And she sort of addresses that by, revitalizing this notion of Taonga principles. So I think in that kind of debate, the thing that really struck her, and again, I can't speak for her, but it's there in the thesis, that, you know, on the one hand, you had this idea of the Māori modernists, you know, who kind of operated according to the kind of Western art world. And then you had those people that were referred to as contemporary Māori artists, more like Cliff Whiting and co, who had more of a community sort of basis, and their work was more visibly kind of Māori or transcultural, as Bob Yankee would call it. And this gulf was sort of made nonsensical by the figure of Brett Graham, who went to art school, but who was the descendant, you know, of that earlier generation of Māori artists, and who, you know, works with communities and has hekitapu ceremonies at the beginning of his exhibitions, and Anna Marie would argue, instrumentalizes this kind of notion of Taonga. So she sort of argues in the thesis that Brett Graham shows that kind of break that's there in the Pākehā art world and the Pākehā art discourse doesn't really kind of work, and she sort of reaches across that and tries to kind of reconnect it. She did interview Sid Mead actually, and his kind of periodization of Māori art, that kind of idea of growth and stuff, is, I guess, in a way slightly problematic for modern and contemporary art, because he was a bit ambivalent, it seems, about a lot of the modern and contemporary stuff that didn't perhaps look Māori and operate in a kind of a tribal sort of setting, as you know. So there was lots of sort of debates and things about that. And I guess in a way what I was trying to do was kind of, you know, put forward Anna Marie's kind of ideas for arts in transition, sort of in that period of the 80s, 90s, and now, and relate that back to the early sort of 20th century. So yeah, you know, your position working in a museum and art gallery is a really interesting one in regard to all of those kind of categories and how they work, and how you might employ those categories for visitors, you know, particularly overseas, trying to make sense of this, of these objects.
Let's just say it's a challenge.
All right.
But a fun one.
Look forward to seeing what you come up with.
Ivan.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks so much for this, Conal. It's absolutely fascinating and very, very clear. I feel I understand some more about the whole area that you were talking about. I want to ask something which in a way follows on from what Maya put much more eloquently than I can. And it's, I don't want to appear tactless in asking this question, but it is a contrarian question. So forgive me if it does come across tactlessly. It's not meant to be tactless. This is following on from the Maori modernists from the 60s. Is there still an area of practice or a group of Maori artists who don't want to be identified as specifically Maori, and who want to work in a way that is, as it were, internationally Pākehā? Does every Maori artist now, more or less, want to identify as such? Or is there still a group of opinion or a representation of that earlier, if you like, cosmopolitan way of thinking about a role as being an artist?
Thanks, Ivan. As I think I alluded to in the talk, no, there are certainly artists like that. I think I mentioned the example of Ralph Hōtere, who was one of the first artists whose work was collected by mainstream art galleries, often without reference to any kind of Māori subject matter or titles or words or whatever that actually appeared in his work. And, you know, famously he said that any reading of his work in Māori terms was incidental to his identity, you know, that he was an artist who happened to be Māori. And then in the 80s, when that became quite, you know, politicised, Bob Bianchi said exactly the opposite, that he was a Māori who happened to be an artist. So yeah, there are definitely people, you know, right across that spectrum, for sure. There's just been a new biography actually of Ralph Hōtere by Vincent O'Sullivan, which is really, really interesting. And it looks at Ralph's background in the Hokianga in the far north and explores all of those kind of elements of his work, and talks about how shy he was and he wouldn't talk about his work, and was really reluctant to be interviewed and to explain or interpret it. And talks a bit more about that refusal of kind of identifying as Māori. In fact, Ralph refused to join the Taikaka exhibition that Ngāpuna Waihanga organised at the National Gallery in 1990-1991. He stepped out of it and wouldn't exhibit because Para and Cliff had this explicitly sort of Māori framework for the exhibition, and he didn't want to associate with that. So that was an interesting, you know, that's an interesting example of that debate of the time. And there are contemporary Māori artists like Michael Parakowhai, whose work actually comments on that debate. So he had that work called Kiss the Baby Goodbye, which is a sort of a kōwhaiwhai kind of panel artwork, which comments on those issues of kind of identity and culture and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'd point you to Vincent O'Sullivan's biography if you want to dig into Hōtere's work a little bit more. But yeah, there are certainly people like that.
Thank you.
Helen, and then Leonie.
Kia ora, Conal. I'm curious about Best's tenure at the Bishop, and about this, you know, this idea that we things Maori in one hand and things Pākehā in the other, and what wiggle room there might be for influences from the rest of the Pacific.
So Ngāwhara and Buck worked together in the 20s, but by 1926, Buck had taken up an offer to join the Bishop Museum expeditions in the Pacific, and pretty much for the rest of his career, he was based in Honolulu. lectured at Yale, kept up this correspondence with Ngata, came back a couple of times, but was pretty much after that kind of identified as a sort of a Pacific anthropologist. And he was certainly open to lots of different Pacific arts, and he wrote extensively on Hawaiian arts and crafts. He did field work in the Cook Islands, Samoa, South Pacific mostly. So he's a really interesting figure because he is very cosmopolitan, knew Boas, met Whistler, knew all of the kind of anthropologists of the day. And there's a hilarious account in the 1920s of him giving a lecture in the Pan-Pacific Science Congress in Sydney, where he shows that very image that I showed you of Ngata and Buck making the tukutuku panel, and some film footage as well. And he relates how Rivers, I think it was, in the audience, or maybe someone from Cambridge who was involved in the Torres Strait expeditions, were really impressed with what Ngata and Buck and their colleagues were doing. And one of them said, "I wish I was a Māori." So they referred quite openly to their kind of international engagement as propaganda, as a series of stunts which they used to attract attention, advance their agenda, get funds, and achieve their kind of tribal objectives, their local objectives, while engaging with this kind of international sort of discourse. And in their letters, which are really fascinating, you see Ngata and Buck talking about the analysis of Pacific arts and culture, and who's best placed to do this, and the value you can get from international anthropologists. But a lot of the time what they're talking about is hocus pocus, and it's really only us who understands the stuff and we should be talking about. So, it's really fascinating to see this, what I sometimes refer to as the dance of agency between these Indigenous intellectuals and that kind of international art world, particularly around the Pacific Rim. And in a way, I suppose you could say that that was merely an earlier example of the kind of thing that Mead did with Te Māori in the 80s, and that a lot of international artists are doing today, both speaking to a local audience and an international audience. It's kind of both and rather than either or in both cases, I think. Thanks, Helen.
Leonie?
Yeah, thanks so much for this talk. This was great. I was just wondering if you could talk maybe a little about the process of making art and knowledge transfer, and in like this question of literacy and yeah, just kind of the art making.
Ngata doesn't have much particularly to say about that. I mean, I guess the best example of their attitude to that was the School of Arts and Crafts, which started out as they were worried in the early 20th century that a lot of these practices were dying out. And they identified older practitioners and they brought them into the school to teach the younger ones the practices so that they could keep them going, and often used models from museums as the kind of ideals of what it is they were trying to achieve. And then later on, kind of things developed further and kind of loosened up. I think their attitude to making was quite pragmatic, and the terminology existing at the time of arts and crafts was kind of interesting, because in many ways it was and is more analogous to what we understand today as craft than art. They didn't have a kind of a precious, aestheticized notion of the making, of the creation of art, in the sense that you sometimes get within Western sort of art history. It was something that people do to meet quite pragmatic needs, and you can see from the range of material that Ngata talks about that all sorts of things can be thought of as whakapapa: nets, baskets, food stages, rafters, the parts of the house, lattice work panels, fibre arts, as well as the things that, like carving, that I guess in many ways have been singled out by Western artists as being similar to sculpture. So they see that more as something that's art because it's kind of a sculptural three-dimensional form like art. And what was happening, I guess, in the production of those things was this connection of the ancestral past to the present, often through the kind of function of those things and the way they were used, this pedagogical kind of function of transmission of knowledge to a younger generation, and just that kind of community setting. And that's one of the things that's, I guess, a point of debate and tension in the 70s and 80s, is, as Maya alluded to earlier, when you've got people like Cliff Whiting and Paramatchik doing community projects that are also contemporary art, that's quite different to the kind of art that others within Māori modernism are doing that ends up in art galleries that don't have that kind of connection. Where that comes together in a really interesting example is in the work of Selwyn Muru, a really interesting artist who took over the Dowse Art Gallery in Lower Hutt once and turned it into a marae where people put mattresses on the floor and slept overnight in the middle of the exhibition. So he turned the art gallery back into a sort of a meeting house and kind of reclaimed that space in a sense. And Jonathan Mane Fiuki described that in the 1980s as being brown art in white spaces. And Bob Yankee referred to it being a kind of a takeover of the institutional space by those artists in the community. While at the same time, at the very same time, other artists in other parts of the kind of art world were quite happy to have their work displayed as art in that kind of sense. So I don't know whether I've answered your question there. There's nothing specifically, I don't think, that Ngata or Buck say about the kind of making. Perhaps the final comment I'd make on that is that tension of art and craft remains, despite decades and decades of people trying to break down that division between the two. You still get this kind of sense, I think, in the Western art world, this diffidence about ordinary everyday material culture, and that only certain things are art, and that only certain people are artists, and that kind of division kind of remains, whereas for those people, it perhaps didn't exist.
I'll again invite some of our virtual guests to type any questions into the Q&A. Just going off of that conversation there, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, Conal, to reflect on is not so much driven by the particularity of the material you shared with us, but more the sort of larger contexts. But this conversation sort of led right into it naturally. And that is, in various on my classes, we've been talking recently about the difference between in a kind of current discourse, sort of decolonizing, the gesture to decolonize museums and the gesture to indigenize them. And different people have different ways of reckoning the conceptual distinction between those two concepts. But it strikes me that some of the strategies you were just talking about, some of those sort of moments, fit sort of more neatly in the indigenizing category than in the decolonizing category. And I just wonder, I just love to hear you reflect a little bit from both the contemporary but also the historical context in New Zealand about where Linda Tuwai Smith's decolonizing methodologies comes from, which was so instrumental in introducing that vocabulary into the international kind of discourse.
Well,
whether that's an operative distinction there or not.
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I'm not so qualified to talk about the contemporary stuff. I think that there is an element of people, again, having a dollar both ways. I can think, for example, of Sean Mallon, who's the curator of Pacific Cultures at Te Papa, just finished his PhD in anthropology, and he argues on the basis of kind of an ethnography of his work over 20 years at Te Papa, collecting and exhibiting, Pacific culture, that there's a debate between whether people decolonize or indigenize. And some people would prefer the more political decolonizing of the structure and system, and others prefer the indigenization approach. And he senses a preference for indigenization. going back 20 years to the 70s and 80s, the vocabulary was different. People didn't use that vocabulary necessarily, but you could see this, the kind of thing, I suppose, that Hirine Moko Mead and co were doing in part was to set up a Maori or Indigenous museology, Maori models of museums, whare Taonga, cultural centres, whatever you want to call them, outside that kind of Western sort of structure of museums with their own sort of categories and principles and so on and so forth. While at the same time, others, were quite pragmatic and wanted to work with existing structures. If you go back to the early 20th century, I think the vocabulary and the perspective is really different, but there were similar kind of impulses. At times, Ngata, Buck, Pōmari, and others worked inside the system. At other times, they worked outside the system and against it. I have to say that generally my focus is on the historical period. And I do find that in the analysis of museums and exhibitions and so on, that the post-colonial critique is rather unhelpful because it does tend to back project contemporary concerns and rather black and white notions of race, culture, time, identity, and so on onto the past when those things didn't necessarily exist. And it can overlook many examples of Indigenous agency, challenge, intercession, but also people who prefer to work within the system, who you can't necessarily discount as being, compromising because of what they were doing at that particular time. I was really struck by what Margaret Allbell said many years ago in debates about Maori art, when she said that answers to many contemporary questions lie in the archives. They lie in Maori manuscripts that were written not long after contact that elucidate a lot of these kinds of issues. And unfortunately, we're in the situation where a lot of that material still has not been looked at or read or used. So there's a certain ahistorical element, I think, to the contemporary debate. And what I always try to do is historicise those things by looking back to see what people were doing 100 years ago. And I think Ngata's work is very enlightening in that regard.
Thank you. We do have a question. Maya, I saw you unmute yourself. Do you want to chime in there?
It's just kind of tying in what both of you were just saying, and the question about making, I think, because it is interesting, isn't it, Conal, that image that you show, which is so incredible, of the bringing together and the union and assembly of, as you say, arts and crafts are, running workshops, and then the carvers are there, and they're doing the carving, and the women are in the back and they're doing the tukutuku panels. And then, so these things are all, separated, as you've just said. And then something happens when, in that incredible image where you've got the kōwhaiwhai painted rafters, the tukutuku panels, the carving, and each of those art forms in its own right is a whole cosmology, to the grooves in the moko, in the tipuna, in the carvings, and then there's a whole kind of language and cosmology embedded in the system that is the kōwhaiwhai, which is its own thing, and then the tukutuku panel. So when you bring all those together, as they did, there was a moment where they bring those together, and that's where you kind of leverage the Whakapapa, the animation, the kind of activation of that space. So in a way, whether they were calling it indigenizing the space or not, they weren't seeing it as, they were kind of separating each of those out, and then there's something that happens in that assembly. And I think that image that you showed is so spectacular, because you see it all kind of come together in Te Ao Māori, in a kind of Māori cosmology, a spatial cosmology. It's embodied knowledge, and you walk into it. So they don't understand, Māori don't understand it's flipped out. It just becomes this thing. So there's these kind of different steps in the process in a way. But I guess that was very natural to people then. You didn't want to keep it separate. So there's that moment where they bring those things together in Wharenui and create them. It's not right to just kind of leave them on the workshop floor on their own. They make sense when they're brought together in that moment.
Yes, exactly, Maya. I think you're absolutely right. When things are collected in a museum, there's a tendency to separate them out into different categories and put them into different parts of the museum. And we've seen this with, visual and material culture generally, that they're separated and sort of dismembered in that kind of Western sort of archive or kind of, museum collection. And what tends to happen is, in what you're talking about there, is a kind of a reassembly into a kind of a indivisible kind of form. And again, it's that kind of reassembling the social, to sort of use that Latourian term, that seems to be a corollary to what Māori are doing with this kind of community-based kind of art. There's a fascinating passage in a letter from Ngāti Te Bak where he talks about them building a whare through the School of Arts and Crafts, and all the materials arrive and everything's in bundles lying on the paddock and separated out into the wire and the wood and all the rest of it. And then over the coming weeks, it all kind of comes together into a whole. And again, I think you can kind of liken his notion of that kind of reassembling of the bits into a kind of a whole to this kind of idea of assembling the component parts into something that's kind of complete in a way, in a kind of a social and relational way. So yeah, reassembling the social.
I love the idea that the meeting house does that, and also the exhibit does that in ways that are not exactly the same, but parallel in certain ways. It's actually a great lead into the question that's been posted to the Q&A, which is, are there gendered aspects to either the Maori making / art practices, particularly weaving, or the ways in which weaving worlds are also social or cultural metaphors?
Absolutely. And Mike could talk about this as well. And there's some debate about whether these gendered aspects of artistic practices are traditional, that horrible word, customary, or whether they developed as a result of Western acculturation. So you saw in the photographs that the men were doing the carving and the women were doing the tukutuku. And Ngata has often been criticised for imposing this kind of orthodoxy on Māori arts and crafts at the time. He was High Church Anglican, he was a royalist, and people like Deirdre Brown and others have sort of said that he kind of, his conception of Māori art sort of froze art forms at a particular kind of time. But there are historical examples of female weavers, even of Wakatoa, of war canoes. And today there are lots of male weavers. So those boundaries are, I think, not impermeable. And I think if you again, well, there's a PhD thesis just been completed by Rangi Te Kanawa, who's a textile conservator, formerly at Te Papa, and a weaver from that famous weaving family from Ngāti Maniapoto. And she talks about that practice of weaving and talks to male weavers today. And I think it's a much more kind of fluid thing than has been described in some quarters. Yeah, I don't know whether Mai, you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say that's on point as far as researching the archive goes, isn't it? That things get fixed in a way. People try to classify, fix down, a certain model of Maori in the era that you're talking about. So, with Elston Best, and when those ethnographies are being written, and what you're always trying to do, I think, is unpick that a bit by going a bit further back, because it was prone to be quite rigid, that classification, and I think there was more fluidity, as you've described it, than has been accounted for. So we look back to those sources, but we do have to read them quite critically, I think. We have to bear that in mind, don't we, when we look at them, because people can take that and run with it and think that that's how it was. And I think actually, Te Ao Tawhito, if you go further back, you can dig into some other stuff. Yeah.
Kia ora.
And it's so interesting, the kind of the temporal overlap between, as Conal, as you started with, the kind of salvage project to recover, but also to sort of to inscribe the past into the kind of colonial anthropological archive, and that language of then using those inscriptions to support a Renaissance, right? To then support a period of a creative efflorescence, of change, and those discourses of stability and ossification and creative transformation are often sort of twined together in ways that aren't, maybe apparent so much at the time.
And Aaron, that's a really interesting parallel to the kind of work that you've done, with Native Northwest Coast. And I remember talking to you and Ira Jackness and others about very similar kind of developments across the Pacific, in the Northwest Coast and Aotearoa.
Yeah, that's why I've long appreciated and admired your work, Conal. The parallels are fascinating. The temporalities are a bit different, which is really interesting to think about, but so many of the dynamics are very parallel. Well, I think we're just about out of time. We're out of raised hands and posted questions. So I'll use this opportunity to thank you, Conal, for your presentation, and to thank my co-panelists for your participation, and to everyone who joined us. We hope to see everybody at future events, and please visit our website for more information. And I wish everybody a wonderful evening or day or morning, whenever you are. And thanks again, Conal, for the really rich conversation.
Pleasure. Kia ora tātou.
Good night, everybody.